Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Wendy Cadge, and on behalf of the leadership of the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab based at Brandeis University, we're really happy to welcome you to today's webinar about distance funerals, complicated grief, and gathering to grieve during COVID-19. Before we begin, just a couple quick technical pieces. So we're on a GoToWebinar platform. You all should be able to see the question box. As you have questions, please type them right into the box. And after the presenters have shared their materials, we will move through those questions as quickly as we can. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared in the next 24 hours with all of the handouts. Undoubtedly, one of the presenters will mention something wonderful that you want a copy of. We will follow up with the presenters after this afternoon and ask them for copies of things they've mentioned and send as many as possible. I'm right now getting all the alerts that tells us that our webinar is full at 501 people. So anyone who has not been able to get on the platform will get a copy of the recording and all of the handouts. So please assure friends that you hear of having problems that that's possible. Also, if for any reason any of you are in the same location on two different terminals and you can safely be 6 feet apart on the same terminal, you would free up a spot for somebody else to join us. All right. There's also a chat box where we will try to respond and share resources, but know that we're going to pull the questions out of the question box. So without further ado, let me thank you all for being with us, and to Zach Willett, who did the organizing of Ally Health. Zach, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Michael, for all of your behind-the-scenes work to pull together all the technology that makes this possible. I'm honored to be joined today by 5 incredible panelists who we're going to hear from, but I want to just start with a little bit of grounding for all of us. I feel like this is a time when grounding could be useful. And so if it's possible for you to physically ground yourself, if that means your feet or the part you sit on, or even just your elbows, a way to feel connected to the earth and grounded, I think this is a time that will serve you well. I have a couple of slides to start, and then we have our panelists, and I'm saving as much time as possible for Q&A, because I know that once you hear from these panelists, you're going to want to know more from them. So I've also included their websites on the slides when I introduce them. So without any further ado, let's begin. Science tells us that human language began about 40,000 years ago. There's archaeological evidence that the first ritual burial by humans happened at least 100,000 years ago. It is in our DNA to care for our deceased. Before we even had words for our grief, we had ritual to help it. And yet, we're in this time of a global pandemic. We know from reliable sources that COVID-19 could be the primary cause of death just in the US alone of between 100,000 of our brothers, sisters, siblings, and 240,000. And further, if current conditions continue, as we have evidence to believe they will, it is likely that all who die in a hospital will die alone. Due to the shortage of PPE and the risk of the virus spreading. And further, the healthcare staff providing that care, whether people recover, as most do, or die, as so many will, we imagine, those healthcare staff are experiencing higher levels of work and personal stress from PPE shortage, from ventilator triaging that will trigger moral distress, from isolation from their friends, family, faith communities, and other support that they would normally rely on in this time when a burnout epidemic in healthcare has already been well documented. So I share this not to be too daunting, but to know that we have to be grounded in the truth. One of the functions of a funeral, of a memorial service, of a gathering after someone has died, whatever language you use for that, is to help us grapple together with what many consider the scariest of the scary unknowns, death. We gather to mourn the death but also to remember and honor the life, and also to support one another as a community. These three functions each have been momentously complicated by COVID-19, but this is important. Those complications are not unprecedented. Humans, this resilient, creative, tenacious species we belong to, have confronted these challenges before. And today we are here to learn from history and to learn from one another. We know how the individual and the collective, the communal, are interconnected. We're doing our best today to speak to both and to speak to the connection between the personal and the communal. I believe that it is daunting and, like I said, incredibly hopeful. With our every action, we have the power to shape the whole. We have such a wisdom of wealth to share, and I really want to leave time for Q&A. So my job is to manage our time. We have amazing panelists, and you may see me interrupting in a polite Minnesota way to ask them to bring their remarks to a close in order to leave room for the next presenter and then the Q&A. So let's begin. I am honored, and I'm hoping my technology is supporting me here. There we go. Alua Arthur is going to be our first panelist. She supports people as they answer the question, what must I do to be at peace with myself so that I may live presently and die peacefully? She's a death doula, an attorney, and the founder of an end-of-life planning organization called Going with Grace that you have the link for on the page. Alua, I'm so honored you're here. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Zach. I want to start by saying that I pulled myself up off the couch, which in the last few weeks, it's been a constant struggle between laying there, feeling the weight of everything that's going on and trying to find ways to be useful in it while also honoring my own feelings around it. So I think I want to start there, which is in this space where there is a lot of collective grief. There's the individual grief, and then there's grief over what's happening in the collective overall. It's wildly important for me and all of us, I believe, to spend time honoring, acknowledging, integrating, being present with whatever it is that I'm feeling. As we were talking about this, the phrase "as within, so without" kept coming up. And there are times where I feel incredibly incapable of supporting in a way that is actually useful for the people that are dying alone. There isn't anything that I can do to fix that, and that leaves me a lot of times feeling powerless. Primarily because my work is based around being in support of people as they are dying, actually walking them through. I can't do that the way that I've been able to in the past. Yet the root of the work is to support and empower other people through their death. The death doula provides non-medical care and support of the dying person and the family through the process. Well, I've been doing it bedside. I've been doing it with touching feet. I do it by passing Kleenex, but I also do it by supporting people and empowering them to do it themselves. A big part of my role is to support people in bringing death care back home, in reclaiming how we care for our dead, how we care for our dying, how we care for ourselves through the process and outside the industries that have been built already. And since that's the case, I can do that. I can empower people to do it the way that we can do it, which is to give them the information they need, provide resources, encourage creativity, do the question asking to get to the root of the issue. Recently, my best friend's father died, and they spent a bunch of time trying to figure out how to best memorialize him, what to do. And they were in New York City, which, as we all know, is now the epicenter of this pandemic in the United States. And so the desire to gather to support him, but also to keep everybody safe. He was elderly, a lot of his friends were elderly. The desire to keep everybody safe was really important. So as we talked, she just kept saying, well, I want my son to pay his last respects to his grandfather. And it's a sentiment that we're all familiar with. We've heard this term before, pay last respects. So I said to her, well, what does that mean? What does that actually mean to you? And she said, well, he needs to be able to see him dead. He needs to be able to say whatever it is that he needs to say. I just want him to thank him for having been this guiding force in his life. And so once we started digging into the root, what is the purpose of this gathering? What do you need from it? It created space for creativity so that we could really understand why we're doing what we're doing. Are we doing it because we've always done it? Or can we do it in ways that honor where we are right now and honor the root of what actually needs to get done? And so all that to say that of the silver linings, I guess, of this pandemic, and of course, I'm really hesitant to go to the bright side, but the silver linings I'm finding is creating a lot of space for creativity, and balancing that creativity with the need to also just be with exactly what is, which is a lot of grief.
Yeah. Alua, I really appreciate you saying the naming the temptation to go to the positive. Can you say a little bit more about that? I remember when we talked earlier, you were like, yeah, a lot of us who go into this field, we're kind of fixers by nature. And here's a situation where we can't fix it. And to your point about empowerment, we really shouldn't fix it because that disempowers people. Can you say more about that?
Also, we just can't fix it. And that leaves so many of us who do this work entirely feeling so powerless, so powerless. I teach death doulas, and I gathered with a group of them on Zoom last night. And one of them said that her impulse is to immediately teach. When she's trying to skirt grief or trying to skirt her feelings, what she does is she teaches. She goes and she gives. She's in service as a way to distract from whatever it is that she might be feeling. And this is a time where, as I mentioned, I've been wanting to sit on the couch, but I also feel like I need to say and do something. And it's like, or I could just say and do exactly what I need, which is to sit with my deep, deep, deep feelings right now and honor those, because I can't fix. And that powerlessness, there's growth in that for me. There's benefit in feeling powerless. And so when I'm doing my best.
Yeah. There's benefit and there's also authenticity. And I think one of the things you're reminding us is like, whether we're physically bringing our presence to somebody or we're doing it over the phone or email or texting, what we bring is our whole selves, whether we want to or not. Our authenticity is our strength. And we do a disservice if we only operate out of the place that's like, oh, everything's gonna be fine. Just like we do a disservice if we only operate out of the place that's like, everything's falling apart, right? We gotta be whole, we gotta be all of the above. And I like you reminding us, as within, so without, we bring ourselves. Oh, and there's our little time limit. How about that? Perfect timing. Thank you. We'll come back to her with Q&A, but I want to shift now to Glenda Stansbury. I'm going to see if I can share that information so you can see on the screen her website. I invited Glenda here because she trains people of all tradition and of no tradition to serve as funeral celebrants. And that's mostly been in person, but she and her team have been leading a way to help people learn how to do that from afar as well. She's a licensed funeral director and embalmer, a mortuary school professor, and creator and lead trainer for Insight Institute Certified Funeral Celebrants Program. She serves as the CEO of Insight Books. Glenda, I'm so glad your experience can be brought to bear here as well. Please.
Thank you, Zach. This is really exciting for me. I've done 6 webinars in the last 2 weeks, and they've all been for a bunch of funeral directors. So to talk to somebody else is kind of fun because, you know, the funeral profession, of course, is really struggling with how to do this. And so I come from several different tracks. Yes, I am a funeral director. Yes, I teach student funeral directors, but my joy and my passion is training people to be funeral celebrants, and that's a 3-day training. I can do it in 30 seconds here. Basically, you know, we train people to do the kinds of services that fit the needs of people, whether that means it has religious elements or whether it means it doesn't. Whatever that family needs, then we create a unique, one-of-a-kind service for them. We've been doing it for 20 years. We've got 4,000 celebrants all over the world, some of whom are chaplains, some of whom are doulas, some of whom are, you know, come from a great different traditions to figure out. The very first thing you said today was words. Words are powerful. Words heal. Words hurt. Words do a whole lot of things. And so we've been doing this work for a long time, knowing that the most important thing that happens at the time of death is that gathering and the words and the honoring and those kinds of pieces. So when all of this came about, I too, I'm a fixer. I have 7 jobs, and and I'm going to work at all of them at all times. I thought, gosh, what can I do? What can I do? And I kind of had to pull back from that. And then it finally dawned on me that in the funeral world, in the celebrant world, in the chaplain world, in all of these places, all of our rules are broken. All of our boxes are destroyed. And so it's no longer even thinking outside of the box. We're creating new paths and new navigations for what this means. And part of me finds great excitement in that because I could speak from the funeral world. Funeral directors are, the 7 last words. We ain't never done it that way before. Getting funeral directors to change is kind of like turning the Titanic and rearranging the deck chairs, right? And so I find this really exciting that I can say to funeral professionals, whoever they are, or people who are in death care, look, all the rules are off. You don't have to call Reverend Billy Bob because you've always called Reverend Billy Bob. Let's think of different ways to have service. Let's think of different ways to reach people. So last weekend, I sat down and gathered some of my celebrants together and through email, and we created a book of ceremonies that we've just distributed to anybody who wants them, that acknowledges we're from afar, but we can still grieve together. And how do we do that? And what do those words look like? I'm tonight at 5 o'clock my time, I'm doing a funeral by Zoom for people all over the country. And so the sweet little lady, 98 years old, died in Des Moines, and people are scattered all over the place. So I'm going to sit down in front of Zoom, and we're going to light candles together, and we're going to tell her story, and we're going to acknowledge that being apart does not mean we can't be together. I'm writing another service that will be posted on a funeral home website tomorrow. They don't want to have a service per se right now, but they want something. So we're writing a service that can be posted on their website. I think the thing that scared me the most when all of this first happened was I heard funeral professionals say, well, we'll just bury him, or we'll cremate him, or do whatever, and then we'll have a service in July. It will be like planning a wedding, and we'll have something in July. And every bone in my body starts aching because, then you're asking people to hold their breath until July. I've done services for families who waited 4 months, 6 months. And when I sat down with them in a family meeting and said, I bet that sounded better on paper than it was in real life. And they said, yeah, because you can't start. There's something within us that's really hard to take that next step until you've had that sacred gathering of whatever that means. So that's why I've been so sounding the horn of, yes, we have to take care of the bodies now, and I understand that things have to happen now as far as how we care for our dead, but we also need something now, whether that means Zoom, whether that means, whatever that means, that we really do need to stop and acknowledge that grief right now. If we can have a bigger gathering in July, that's great, but I also know that families are going to say, yeah, we'll come back. And they won't. And we've got a whole bunch of broken people out there who didn't have that.
Glenda, I really appreciate that point. And I also appreciate what you shared with me earlier about how the loss of a life is part and parcel with all these other losses right now. Jobs, predictability, freedom to go where you want, plans that were made. So I really appreciate you lifting that up as well.
Thank you.
And when you were talking about the waiting, it made me think of one of the resources we're sharing is a series of articles from journalism recently. And there was a Washington Post article on the 16th of March where this woman whose father felt short of breath was taken to the hospital and then never saw his family or talked to them again. He died of COVID-19. She said, Dad is waiting to be buried. and we're waiting to tell him goodbye.
Yeah.
It's worse than war. Right now, our family's living in a suspended state.
Yeah, and the sad part about this is we could really focus on the COVID patients and the tragedy of that and the difficulty of that, but death happens every day.
Yes.
The service I'm writing for tomorrow is a sweet 70-year-old lady who died of a heart attack in front of her husband. So we have to be ready to open up and incorporate everything. The other piece that I wanted to say very quickly, I didn't watch my time. I figure you're going to tell me when to be quiet.
Yeah.
I find this a wonderful time for collaboration. I'm excited to speak with doulas and with chaplains and with rabbis and with people of the faith and people of the funeral profession and all those different kinds of things. Truly, this is a chance to open those lines of communication and to think differently about what our roles look like, because we have a tendency to kind of be in our narrow little path. And I know chaplains hang out at the hospital or the hospice and they do their thing and then I do my thing or whatever. And maybe this is our chance to look at community differently.
Yeah. And Glenda, in that spirit, I'm going to use that as a segue to introduce Perla.
Okay.
Perla Torres is the Family Network Director for the Colibri Center for Human Rights, which is based in Tucson, but does work very broadly. I invited her in particular because she's not someone that field is not someone we've reached out to before, but this is the time to do that. As I wrote, Perla serves families who have experienced loss at the border between the US and Mexico, building solidarity, community, and a movement. She's a former case manager for the Office of Refugee Resettlement with the US Department of Health and Human Services. And what I asked her to speak to in particular was her experience accompanying families whose loss is so ambiguous, because not only do we not have a body to gather around, as has served us for millennia, but we don't even know for sure if their person has died or what their experience was as they died. So I'll say no more. I'll just say, Perla, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much, Zach, for that introduction. I understand that my profession is, a little bit different, and the deaths that Colibri bears witness to are very specific. It's a very specific type of death. So just to give a little bit of background information, the Colibri Center for Human Rights is an NGO with a mission to end disappearance and uphold human dignity along the US-Mexico border. My role specifically is to work in solidarity and in mutual support with families who have experienced this type of ambiguous loss, that have had a family member gone missing or disappeared along the border. There is an immense tragedy happening in this border where a lot of people are dying and are dying alone in these situations. And my aspect of the work is that I accompany through mutual support and solidarity of these families regarding what's going on. So we do I provide spaces for them of support and for grief during these type of very specific situations that these families are going through. So Zach, how you mentioned the type of ambiguous loss that is felt by these families is very specific. It's very specific also how you would see maybe of a parent having a child who was disappeared. And how that relates to COVID-19 in these times is because of all of the unknown regarding this virus, how it's affecting people. Every day it seems that we're getting on the news and we're receiving all these new types of information of who's immune, who's not immune, who's showing symptoms, who's not showing symptoms. So all of this unknown that we're living day to day, and having families who are having to grieve and having to almost prolong this grief. Glenda, how you were saying that families are being asked to wait a certain amount of time, not seeing their loved one. That is a big trauma that these families are going to have to endure later on, and how that grieving process is going to extend is going to be very, very, very important as to how we, once everybody is integrated back into society, how these communities are going to feel, how we're going to support these communities. That's really what I really want to touch base on, how we can provide these spaces of support. to have mutual solidarity with these families, because what they're going to endure is very lonely, and it's going to be because of that lack of closure or understanding, it can leave a person to be reaching for answers that they might not receive right then and there. And not only does that complicate, but it really prolongs the grieving process. Another thing I want to touch base on is the humanizing these public deaths in a way that promotes healing and solidarity. A lot of the times in the news, what we're seeing is, numbers and statistics, and, we're seeing graphs and we're seeing pie charts all the time. And it's very similar to my line of work of how we see migrants crossing the border. You give them a number, and we find their remains, and that's really all that's left of them, and what the things that they carried along their journey. And what I'm seeing in the media is the same type of representation. We should be humanizing these deaths. These are our neighbors, these are our brothers, these are our sisters. These are people that we should be humanizing in a way to be able to create that solidarity for the families who are on the other end of that TV screen, right? Those families that need our support and need our need our support to be able to grieve in a community setting. So I think that it would be really beautiful. And of course, these are like answers that are questions that nobody has all these answers to, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or in 6 months. But I urge everybody to have that in the back of their brain. How are we going to incorporate everything that we've seen back into society, and how are we going to build this solidarity in these communities?
Yeah, it's such an important question, Perla, and I'm grateful for the voice that you give it and the experience you bring to it. One of the things I know you mentioned that I wanted to hear more about is this notion of hope. Like, what does hope look like over time? So yeah, just say more about that.
Yes. So it specifically, in the families that we work with, hope looks very different in very different stages. And I'm assuming that, with COVID-19, hope is going to look very different as we proceed. And as the family goes through these different stages, how we see it in the family of migrants is initially they have hope that these family members are alive, and that hope is very important. And it's also something that these families really, 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 you'll see, cling on to. We see hope of that their family members are still alive, even if it's been 5-6 years that their family member has been disappeared. And it, that hope turns into, I hope they didn't suffer any pain. I hope that they weren't in physical pain. I hope that they're safe wherever they're at. So that hope over time looks very different. And I think that we'll see that as well with families dealing with the tragedy of COVID-19, is that hope is going to look very different as we see things go. I hope that they can recover. I hope they're not sick. I hope that they aren't in pain. I hope they're in a better place. So we really have to harness that hope, and really harness that as someone who accompanies families in this, that is something that even if through our information we know isn't necessarily true, maybe we know that they have passed away, and we have science, we have evidence, we have DNA evidence to know what really happened to them. It's really important to have the families cling on to whatever, and a lot of them are in religious aspects. So I think that that's something very beautiful that they hold on to.
What I hear you saying is that whatever hope they have, that's probably helping them cope a lot. And so we don't serve them by saying, that's a terrible hope. Don't hope that. Hope for this other thing.
Right. We never want to lead them to,
But because my guess is
exactly.
other families do evolve over time and come to a different place, but they do that, through as you say, through the mutual support, which we're going to need to figure out what it looks like. It's not coming together for a meal, right? And that's actually a great segue. Right. How about this? Into Casper's work. So let me share his little blurb here. Casper, as the co-founder of Sacred Design Lab, which gets the award for best web address, sacred.design, That's actually a web address. It works. There's no www, there's no .com, .org. It still works. It's great. Casper works to create a culture of belonging and becoming. He's a Ministry Innovation Fellow at Harvard Div School, and he co-hosts the award-winning podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. He's also the author of a forthcoming book, June, I think, called The Power of Ritual, Turning Everyday Activities into Soulful Practices. Casper, I'm super grateful for you to help us make that pivot to like, what do we do now? What does this look like? How can we be smart?
Thanks, Zach, and thanks everyone for who's already spoken. It's an honor to share some thoughts with you. What I'm going to do is share 5 principles for online ritual design. So if you're bringing folks together in grief, in mourning, but this can also apply honestly to birthday parties. So if you in your personal life you have other things that might need ritualizing, I hope these will be helpful principles for you. The first is to, we very quickly orient ourselves around the screen. So the first principle I want to share is to make space physically around you as well as internally before you get onto the screen. So in a funeral context, for example, it might be completely appropriate to wear certain clothing. You might want to be in a certain place in the home. You might want to, do things with light. You might want to decorate things. All of that, even though it's happening on a screen, that process of making space will help get you and others into an emotional place to really engage with what's going to happen in the ritual and the ceremony. And the same thing is kind of internally, whether it's something very simple as taking some quiet time, taking some intentional breaths, maybe doing some journaling before going onto the call. That kind of internal prep work is enormously important. The second one is to really mark time. So if you're hosting the ritual, to kind of really make a clear beginning and a clear ending. When we're in a room together, it's really obvious, but it can be much trickier to know how that's happening when we're in a screen together. So one of the things to think about is, for example, using lighting a candle. It's the same thing. You can do it online. I've been leading song circles online on a Sunday afternoon, where every participant mutes themselves and I sing a line and folks sing it back to me, and you're able to do some very simple rounds together to harmonize together. So to start with singing, for example, at the beginning and the end, again, creating a container in time as well as in space is just a helpful way of putting bookmarks around the experience. If there's one of the principles I think is most important, it's this one, which is to use real things. It's very easy, again, to orient ourselves around maybe like fake backgrounds that we put behind us and all sorts of cool stuff that we can do on the screen. But it's amazing how much we can integrate real physical objects in the ritual. And in some ways, doing it like this allows us to do things that we'd never be able to do if we were all in the same room. So I've used, for example, when invoking the sense of touch or personal connection, to invite people to bring a piece of cloth, which might be a prayer shawl, might be a favorite throw from the sofa, might be perhaps a piece of clothing that reminds us of someone, and to literally place that around the shoulders, to feel that kind of heaviness on the shoulders, like it's a little bit of a hug around us. You might also think about, if you're marking transition, having a bowl of water and an empty bowl, and in front of the camera, kind of pouring it into the other bowl, not getting it on your keyboard, as can happen. But there's all sorts of ways, using plants, using pets. There's all sorts of things that we can do with real physical objects that actually bring out the experience that we want to bring out for folks. Which brings me to the fourth principle, which is about lean into the new. If we just try and recreate what we used to do and put it in front of a camera, it's always going to feel less than optimal. And so I really want to invite you, when you're designing ritual, to think about playing to the strengths of the medium. So for example, I can take my camera off and actually have absolute privacy while still participating in the ceremony. So for example, if I need to hug a pillow and just cry my eyes out, I can do that in a way that it might be much more challenging for someone to do that if we're all in the same place. Of course, it's super culturally dependent on the group that's gathered, but nonetheless, you can do things that you can't do necessarily when you're in person. So leaning into the new. You can share music through Zoom, for example. You can You can create a video playlist that you might want people to watch before they come together on the screen. There's all sorts of things that we can do that really link to the creativity that we heard about before. And finally, think about how you can help people connect to each other. So right now we're in broadcast mode, which is entirely appropriate for a webinar. But for example, you can often use small groups even on a technology platform. So one of the things that we've seen is newlyweds, for example, when they were celebrating their wedding, put all their guests into breakout rooms and kind of like a reception line, joined each breakout room one at a time. So they were with college friends, then they were with so-and-so's family, and then the other's family, and then work colleagues. So you still have that sense of being with the people that you actually want to be with. And so the same is absolutely true with a funeral, where you can perhaps create spaces where folks can be together. So really focusing not just on connecting from the center to the listener or the participant, but how can you orient the online ritual for folks to connect with one another as well. So I hope that's useful. I'll share kind of all of those 5 principles written out in much more detail with examples that Zach will send out. But just gratitude for all of you for the work that you're doing. I know it's not an easy time, but it is appreciated.
And Casper, I did go ahead and copy and paste the 5 points into the chat window. So if you're a visual person like me and you're like, what did he say? I need it written down. It's in the chat window. So feel free to be using that. Our last presenter before we go to a Q&A, and let me thank Trace in advance for his help guiding the Q's and the A's. And Wendy for any shepherding that needs to be happening with that as well. Our last presenter is one, I emailed him earlier. I was like, Rabbi Steve, I kept you for the end for a reason. Rabbi Steve Kaye has 25 years in the field as providing spiritual care and mental health services with the American Red Cross, as well as with local and federal law enforcement agencies. That means in those 25 years, he responded to Columbine, Las Vegas, the shootings there, Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, among others. He's a congregational organizational consultant and coach based in Denver, Colorado. And I've asked him to offer us from the depths of his wisdom, of his experience, but also help us look forward. Because Rabbi Steve, you're, I think, best positioned to help us do that as well. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much. I'd like to meet this guy. Sounds impressive.
Look, humility on top of it all, you guys.
It sounds like in this day and time, it sounds like someone's reading your obituary when people are reading these things. So I hope I take it as a kind attribute. I feel it's a little bit like I'm missing my baseball season, so you assign me to pull it all together. And I think we've really heard some really important views and points made by the presenters before. I want to come back and just frame it a little bit in the notion that we're really in uncharted waters. It's like we're out in the ocean and our compass doesn't know what direction we're going in. Often we've had tools we've relied on. So I want to come back to the Myers-Briggs type personality, the MBTI that many people know. So if you think about people who are the SJs, sensors and judges, their world is structured, everything makes sense, and they come along. And all of a sudden, we need to function as NPs, intuitive and perceivers. And so those who are chaplains who've been exposed to Myers-Briggs, it comes back to remember, even though you may have a certain type, it doesn't mean you can't function the other. It's just a preference. So Myers-Briggs is really, in a sense, guides you in one way how we function. When we expand ourselves, we have to think about how we function in different kinds of ways. And so if we come back to, if anyone's been trained in disaster services, we really think about what Red Cross and other disaster groups do. We start with 4 stages. We talk about mitigation, which is that pre-work, how to get people ready, preparedness, the response, and the recovery. And these 4 stages are really going to play itself out differently for us because, to be truthful, we were really not prepared. Our mitigation and our preparedness is absolutely inadequate, no matter what agency, organization. As we read about things, and not being political anyway, we were really not prepared. And our response, I don't even think we're in the beginning of our response yet. I think in the next 2 to 4 weeks, we're going to see things that we have never seen before in a global village because of things of CNN, Fox News, wherever you get your connectivity. And so what that means for us as people who care for our head and heart and soul, is we've got to be elastic in what we do. We've got to be flexible in what we do. We often think about our roles are a certain prescribed role. And we think about family systems, and we're a son, we're a daughter, we're a husband, we're a partner, we're a spouse, we're intimate with other people. And in family system, you wear many different kinds of hats. And as people who are responding, we need to call upon the multitude of hats that we wear. We've got to be nimble and adaptive. Our past experiences often create a frame of what we think should be normal, and yet we're in a stage where there is no normalcy, and only those past experiences will help get us through that. I think that there are three words that come to mind for me. We've got to be humble, because we just need to be. We've got to be vulnerable. If we're not vulnerable, and I think Casper, you're saying that in different kinds of ways, we've got to be vulnerable and understand that we're going to feel this in many different kinds of ways. And I'm going to use the word prayerful or reflective, whatever your theology is. And I want to take this notion of Trinity and change it from a different perspective. For me, Trinity comes from one of the prayers in Jewish tradition. We talk about the Via Hafta. We talk about your head, we talk about your heart, and we talk about your soul. And so when we think about what way are we entering into these disasters, into these crises, when do we use our head, when do we use our heart, when do we use our soul? And it's meant no disrespect for the traditional Catholic notion of Trinity. It's how do we, as different religious traditions, understand head, heart, and soul, which is really important. Mm-hmm. We're going to think in different ways, and I think Glenda was saying this, that ritual as we've known it is not going to take place. In the Jewish community, for example, we're used to washing the body before we bury it. Right now, if someone dies of COVID disease, there is no washing the body. Bodies are being put in body bags. Ritual garments are not being placed upon people. The clergy are standing graveside, even if they're allowed to do that. They're functioning from maybe even the sidewalk of the cemetery. We're used to sometimes lowering the casket, placing earth upon the casket, and that's not happening. Many of us who are caregivers like to hug and squeeze, and we feel inadequate that we're not able to touch people. And so we've got to rethink what that liturgy means, what it means to be in both real time and memorial, because we know that we remember the memorial events of people's lives, and in different religious traditions, we have times to do that. One of the things I really think about today is, and it's really, people are dying alone. And Alua, you were talking about that in your opening presentation, that we're used to either rubbing people's feet, holding someone's hand, being with them. And right now, if we talking to, as chaplains and as pastoral care providers in healthcare providings, many of us are not allowed into the rooms, and we're watching people gasp for breath. We're watching people die alone. And so we're having what, not only the first trauma of the death of someone not having what we define as a good or healthy death, we're having a secondary trauma, because the nursing care, the physicians, the nurses' aides, they are traumatized. In the literature, we know after Oklahoma City, within 12 to 18 months, there was not one religious care provider, priest, minister, rabbi, pastor, who was in the community in that period of time. People had to leave because of secondary trauma. Well, this is hitting across our world. And the notion is, where are we going to go? You can't go from New York to California. So the question is, how do we take care of those people who are providers? And so the last thing I want to say is, at least in my world, is I often think about predicate theology, not where is God, but when is God. Many of you know Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote a book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And the predicate is really important as we begin to think about whatever our religious tradition is. It really doesn't make a difference in providing care. We have to be present for people. With the largest growing religious denomination in American life are called SBNRs, spiritual but not religious. People go to the mountains, they go for a Zoom class, they go for whatever it is. Zoom has two meanings, the Zoom classes and Zoom that we're doing. We need to get that right pH level. And so the notion is, how do we help people think not where is God, is when is God? So in closing off this piece that I want to do for a moment, Rabbi Kushner, and I will post a lot of these points later on, the cycle of the disaster and this, he said, God does not cause our misfortunes. Some are caused by bad luck, some are caused by bad people, and some simply are inevitable consequence of our being humans and being mortal, living in a world of inflexible natural laws. The painful things that happens to us are not punishments for our misbehavior, nor in they any way part of some grand design on God's part. Because the tragedy is not in God's will, we need not feel the hurt or betrayed by God when tragedy strikes. We can turn to God for help in overcoming it, precisely because we can tell ourselves that God is outraged by it as we are outraged as well. And so this notion of if your theology is different than mine, it's wonderful, but I do not believe in a God that says, okay, people in this city on this day are going to die, and these
Right.
there's a randomness. So as we move forward, we have to understand that our presence, our head, our heart, and soul will make the difference.
Thank you, Rabbi Steve. I'm going to ask Trace to tee up our first question, but while that's happening, let me just say that I keep hearing this, we need to be nimble and adaptive, not just out of the box is gone. And I just want to recognize for us as caregivers and for our society, what a challenge that is in a time of crisis. Neurologically, we have a literal bias in our brains towards the tried and true during a crisis. Or even the tried and it wasn't true, but it's there because that pathway got laid down. New stuff is going to take more effort. So be gentle with yourself, like Alua encouraged us, and all of us in our different ways encourage that. Let's have compassion for our biology when our body tells us to lay on the couch, not judgment that that's not being productive, and productivity is what's going to get us out of this, right? Because over time, we will lay down those new connections. And I mean that neurologically, and I mean that sort of globally and sort of societally. We'll lay down those new connections and we'll add that insulating sheath of myelin so that those become over time more efficient. And that can be a new way. We may need to consider what evidence does each of us individually or communally, what evidence do we have that we've been resilient before, that we've held dread honestly and compassionately, but not been run by it. So I'll step off my soapbox and be like, Trace, what's our first question, friend?
So I'm going to try to synthesize several questions that came in around services that follow customary practice in many traditions is to try to have the service as soon as possible. Sometimes it's even prescribed within 24 hours. Right. Because of the limitations that have been placed on this, what are people beginning to see in terms of innovations with something now and something later? Are people doing something that's an immediate response? How do they involve particularly the closest family members in that? Are they using video? How are they doing that? And then what are they thinking about in terms of a longer term or a follow-up celebration or ceremony? And any of the panelists are welcome to take that.
Thanks, Trace.
I can speak to that just because I'm in the middle of doing a lot of that. Right now, the things that I have seen last week before my state got intentional about really limiting, I had a service with about 15 family members scattered apart, and then we webcast it to everybody else who wanted to be there. Now the funeral homes in my area are pretty much saying we're not going to have any kind of physical gatherings. So we're webcasting immediately, or we are, setting something up by Zoom so everybody can be there. I was enjoying Casper's thing because I'm wearing this outfit today because my service tonight is for a lady who loved gardening. Everybody has been asked to bring flowers to their screen and bring a candle to their screen. We're doing those kinds of very active, engaging kinds of things. And I think there's some people who say, okay, when this is over, whenever this is over, in July and August, maybe we'll get together and go look at the gravesite, go make sure the stone is placed, go make sure we're putting flowers, those kind of things. I think that's the piece that they've put off. But my soapbox is figure out a way to do something right now. If that means video casting, webcasting, whatever that means, so that there are words spoken into that sacred space.
Right. I want to build upon Glenda's response. Many of the religious bodies, interfaith councils, have adopted, which has been very important, rules and regulations for clergy, for pastors, ministers, rabbis, priests, to say graveside services only, minimum of 5 people, 10 people. Sometimes it's dictated by the local governmental authorities. Part of that is really important because it takes the clergy out of being the bad person to say you can't have 25, 30, 50 people at the service. So one is this graveside service. Second is, as we're seeing in some communities, they're only allowing the grave diggers to be there. You've got to work with really sensitive funeral homes and cemeteries that will allow some kind of video thing. Many people are concerned about the liability of that. You know, was the grave lowered okay, and things like that. From a ritual end, you know, Orthodox Judaism, parts of the Islamic community are really struggling with the burials, and all of our religious traditions say that the law of the local community supersedes religious law. So an example, particularly for the Orthodox community, on the Sabbath, you don't bury on Saturday. In Argentina, the chief rabbi ruled recently that Argentinian society said you have 8 hours to bury the body, if not we cremate. So they're allowing in Argentina Jewish burials on the Sabbath that would never happen somewhere else. In Eastern Europe, where there's a high rate of contagiousness, where you never have cremation in the Jewish community, they're allowing cremation to happen because you don't want other people to get sick. So preserving other kind of life. So flexibility is the key, and most of all, the health, safety, and well-being of others. But ritual is very important. And this is the opportunity where people like Casper and Glenda and other people are creating, and all of us on the screen are looking at how do we create new rituals that, you know, because remember, ritual is only a ritual when we say the first annual, the second annual, the third annual. So the question is, how do we not create new things? You know, Thanksgiving is a fairly new holiday, but every American loves it. President's Day is a new holiday. We used to have Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday. So the notion is, how do we be flexible enough? And that's my nimble point before.
Steve, where can people go to find when religious authorities have said there are special rules for now? You've cited some. Where can people go to find those?
I will post that back with you, that most of the boards of rabbis, most of the council of churches are putting out proclamations. The key thing is, as quick as they're being put out, because of the numbers of death and other things, it's changing. So they're meant as guidelines, not as final dictums, and they're really good frames. But I'll send them on to you, Zach, and you can post them. So people who are watching this broadcast now, come back in a day, and you'll have all kinds of links.
Thank you, Steve. Trace, I want to get another question in.
Yeah, one of the questions that sort of, there are many themes of this question, but so there's concern for care for someone who is dying, and particularly when they don't have a lot of contact. One person made the point that the healthcare providers are still present with those who are dying, so often they're not utterly alone. They still have some contact with other human beings, despite PPE and the other barriers that are there. One of the questions, though, is then who cares for those who are doing the caregiving? And what sort of rituals are people beginning to see emerging within clinical care contexts, community contexts? One person noted that they heard a VA psychologist say that they're preparing for a mass psychological casualty event. How do we care for these people that are in this, and especially looking at some of the reports out of places like New York City, where folks are working 18, 24-hour shifts, feeling very little break and very little sense of when it abates.
And I want to, before any of the panelists respond, I want to expand it to not just healthcare folks, but death care folks. I saw Glenda making that point earlier. One of the articles that we share is from Reuters on the 19th, and it talks about in Iran, a funeral manager saying there are no funerals. We work day and night. I've never seen such a sad situation. And in China, there was a death care worker who posted kind of anonymously on social media saying how hard it was. Saying some of our employees don't even drink water because they would need to go to the toilet, and it's difficult to take the protective clothing off. So yeah, how do we care for all of these? Who wants to speak to that? Perla, I saw you taking some notes, so I was hoping that meant you had an idea to share.
I think, you know, it's these individuals who are on the front lines, and it is, I think that it's definitely, you know, what I was writing down is, you know, the article that you mentioned, because And I think I mentioned it when I was speaking, that there really is no, or at least right now, just given how things are changing day to day, there's no, very, very specific, um, way that we are going to be able to collectively heal. And by working in solidarity with these individuals. So I think that it's very important. I'm glad that that's being taken into consideration. Glenda, do you have something?
Well, one of my jobs is I run a publishing company, and my father writes books on grief and elder care, and so I've run his company for 30 years. And he wrote a book called The Power of Presence, and he talks about getting in people's buckets and how that is such a powerful visual for how do we listen to others without trying to fix things. And I think we're going to have to all get very, very intentional about listening to each other's bucket and not try to fix it, not try to make it look better, not try to shine it up, but just to say, this sucks. And it's okay for you to be sad, to be scared, to be sick of being a nurse, whatever. My daughter's a hospice nurse. I'm listening to this every day. And so listening to it without trying to fix it and just get in their bucket and let it be is probably, in how we do that on a global scale, I don't know. That's going to be another kind of organizational piece to discuss. But I think just being so intentional about presence is going to help some of these people who have seen horrors that they do not know how to express.
Yep. So I want to jump in with something very practical. First, I think people who are in healthcare need to be aware that the HIPAA rules and regulations about how you communicate in secure and non-secure approaches has been lifted for now. So things where you used to not be able to have certain phone conversations by HIPAA, you can. So it's very, very important there's a lifting that rule. Second is with many of the law enforcement groups that I'm supporting, we're doing chat rooms late in the evening. Sometimes I want to call it the SBNRs. I have a lot of law enforcement people who are spiritual, not religious. They're seeking something. They're not looking to be drinking because they know what that does. They're not looking to get involved in domestic violence because that's one of the big increases we're seeing. So we're training chaplains to do some chat rooms and groups, which is really very important to do. We're starting with some kind of intentional reading, and we're using the best practices of CISM. We're going to see CISM, critical incident stress management.
It stands for, so everyone knows.
Yeah, critical incident stress management has what we call diffusings and debriefings. There are two different forms after an event. We're trying to take best practices and modify that for the world of Zoom or Skype or someone else. So again, these are the resources. Remember I said you got to be nimble, got to think differently. Jack be nimble, Jack be quick. This isn't going to be quick, and Jack ain't jumping.
Zach, let me add one more thing, and then I'll hand it over to you to thank the panelists because we're just at time now. But yes. Several people have asked about resources that were mentioned. We'll make sure that all of those are posted with the recording so that folks know how to get those, as well as some of the quotes and other authors that were cited as a part of the talks as well. Zach, thank you for your leadership. I'll let you speak to the panel, and then we'll hand it back to Michael.
Yeah. Alua, Glenda, Perla, Steve, Casper, thank you so much for the work you've already done that makes you able to share what you're able to share today. Thank you for sharing it, and thank you for the work that both you will continue to do and the work that you've enabled us all to do. This is not the end of the conversation. The resources we hope will be very helpful, and let's keep the conversation going. I was the Ebola trained chaplain when I was in trauma and ER, and the one thing that I would say in terms of, and this applies for healthcare and death care too, people love it when they have time to join that kind of debrief or defusing. My own healthcare organization now is setting up hour-long chaplain facilitated or behavioral health facilitated conversations for people just anonymously debrief and hear and be supportive. But when that hour isn't possible, when in the emergency room, I would just literally catch somebody's eye, and I considered that pastoral care, because it said to them the one thing, I get a little emotional thinking about it, that they needed to know, which is that they're not alone. And that applies to the families that Perla serves, and that applies to the death care workers and the health care workers. They just need to know they're not alone. There's so much power in that. So with that, I do need to share two more quotes briefly to get them into the recording. Our physical presence, this is from the Order of the Good Death, may be restricted for now, but our imagination and the love we hold for each other is limitless. And my favorite quote on all this is from St. John of the Cross, as rendered by the poet Daniel Ladinsky. And I saw the river over which every soul must pass, and the name of that river is suffering. And I saw the boat which carries each soul across the river, and the name of that boat is love. Thank you for not shying away from the suffering, and thank you for being that love. Be well.
Here we go. I'm going to jump in just for 1 second here at the end, and thank you all again for being here. One thing that Zach didn't say, and that not everyone can see, is the speed with which this was put together, the hectic schedules that we all have right now. You know, it's very difficult to do this, but Zach pulled together a fantastic panel very quickly. So huge thank you to Zach and to all of you for doing this on such short notice. Thank you all for being here. If you came in late or had to leave, well, if you had to leave, you're not here anymore. But for everyone, this is recorded. We will send it out to everyone who is registered. It will go up on the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab website, so it's going to be there for posterity. Don't worry if you didn't catch a reference or the title of a book or a poem or whatever. We will have all of that with the mailing that goes out, so you're not going to lose anything. Once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and we will see you next time. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.